talkers. Okay. Go ahead and begin.
Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Now, I'd like to ask you all to do something that is words I've not really learned before, but I've been asked to ask you to unmute. So if you could all unmute for a minute, I'd like to have you chant with me. And the chant I'm going to use, I will be using during my present. And so when I get ready to chant, you're welcome to join in. All right. So one more time, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And please join me. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? One more time. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Wonderful, wonderful. Suffragists, give yourselves a round of applause and we can go back to an unmute moment or a muted moment, please. Thank you. Thank you. I even see that some of you are wearing the suffragist colors. I see that Mr. David has on a purple shirt and Connie has on kind of a lavender sweater. Oh my goodness, you're all dressed for today in this wonderful Women's History Month. And it's been a delight and an honor to be able to meet you this morning. I want to tell you a little bit about me and how I got my start as a suffragist. I was the second of 6 children born in New Oxford, Pennsylvania. My daddy and mother were Quakers. So we were raised to focus on our education and to make the world a better place. And my daddy always said, when you educate a woman, you educate a family. And my father also said that all it takes for evil to take over the world is for a few good people to do nothing. So with that kind of Quaker background and a focus on the fact that the light of God is in all of us, therein began some of my earnest years to make sure that the world was indeed a better place for all of us. I, as the second of 6 children and with my other sisters, we were able to have a wonderful education. I went off to Swarthmore, which is where I met my husband. And he was very much a suffragist supporter. But before we get too far into that, I do want to talk a little bit about the colors that I just mentioned. You may be able to see that I am wearing a sash that is purple and white and gold, just like my background here, purple, white, and gold. Those were the suffragist colors. Purple stood for loyalty and majesty, white for purity, and also it was the same color as the Women's Temperance League. Those ladies almost always wore white when they picketed in public. And then yellow stood for, as I said before, the light of God that is in all of us. And it was a reminder that the state flower of Kansas was a sunflower, is a sunflower. And that was a reminder that Kansas once had the right for women to vote, but they lost that right. So we are always reminded that losing that 19th Amendment right is something that could happen with a stroke of a pen. So I ask you to continue to get out there. And those of you ladies, please, the best gift you could give any of us suffragists who fought long and hard for the right to vote is to vote whenever you can. So what else I have on today, and I want to show you the pin on my lapel. It is called a jailhouse pin. And I'm very proud of wearing this pin because I was given it in December of 1917 at the Belasco Theater. There were over, in 1917, 100 of us suffragists that were imprisoned, abused, treated miserably at the Occoquan workhouse on the charge of obstructing traffic in front of the White House. And that charge of obstructing traffic carried with it a $25 fine, which I believe would be close to about $600 in your world today, or to spend 60 days in jail. And as you can imagine, as stalwart and as stubborn and as strong as suffragists were, we chose to go to jail. So my story will also include having been arrested on the 14th of July, 1917, and being taken to the Occoquan workhouse for my passion and wanting to make sure women had the right to vote. Robert and I met in a English class at Swarthmore, and it's a very sweet story. I had given a presentation in class one day on Amy Lowell's poem called Patterns. Some of you may be familiar with that poem. It's a very lovely poem, and yet a very sad poem. It's the story of a young woman over in Europe who is walking through the family garden one day, and she has on a beautifully brocaded gown. It is a sunny and yet somewhat cloudy day, and she's noticing all the patterns in the garden, lightness and darkness and lightness and darkness, all the shadows she sees. And she's taken with this beautiful surrounding. And so her focus is in on the patterns that she's seeing around her. During this wonderful walk through her family's garden, she is interrupted by the family valet, who presents her a letter. And in that letter, she reads that her fiance has just died at the Battle of Flanders. With that, and in her deep grief, she tosses the letter to the ground and says to herself, my God, what are patterns for? Thinking, of course, that the light of her life has now been extinguished. Well, after that English class, this handsome tall man came up and offered to take my books and walk me to my next class. Well, I was quite taken with that. And he also said to me, oh my, how much he admired my energy and my mind and my intelligence. Well, with that, I knew this could be a very long and enduring relationship. And indeed it was. After we graduated from Swarthmore, Robert and I were married. My full name was Amelia Himes before Robert and I married. So you can call me if you want to address me today as we do the Q&A as Mimi. That is how I was known to my friends. Well, also at Swarthmore, I met the inimitable Alice Paul. Some of you may have heard of her and her good friend, Lucy Burns. Why, they had the most interesting friendship, for you see, it began in a police station in London in 1912. They had already the same passion I eventually acquired, and that was to make sure that women got the right to vote in the United States of America. So they wanted to go over to England and be able to see what the suffragettes were doing at that time. What were their tactics? What were their strategies? Well, one of their tactics was vandalism. They would throw bricks through windows, graffiti buildings, even set pieces of paper on fire and toss them into buildings. They were doing some pretty naughty things, and Alice Paul and Lucy decided that when they came back to the United States, this was not what they were going to do. They might picket. They might come out and make sure that the country knew how important it was for women to have the right to vote. But they were not going to behave in that kind of a pattern. So with that, they decided to call us suffragists. So when you talk about the suffrage movement in the United States, remember that we are called suffragists, and they adopted the colors I already spoke of, purple, white, and gold. So that is a little bit about my background. One other thing I do want to mention about my mother: we were raised in a very patriotic home. In 1863, when Abraham Lincoln on his train was coming through New Oxford, Pennsylvania, my mother, whose name was Catherine, got to shake his hand. So our parents were very, very proud of being Americans, very proud also of being Quakers, and that is much of my heritage, as was much of the suffragist heritage. Many of my sisters were also Quakers, and we did believe that the light of God is in all of us. We often used a piece of scripture that says, out of the darkness and into the light, especially as we picketed in front of the White House. But I'll get to that in just a minute. So that's just kind of a little bit of a mini background as to who I am. I want to tell you about some of the famous women of our time that we all looked up to. I want to tell you about some of the travesties that also pushed for the right to vote in this country. some events that happened that made the entire public sit back and say, yes, we need to be protecting our women. So a little bit of background, and then a bit about what it's like to have a suffragist meeting. Our meetings were very almost Quaker-like. And so we'll talk about that, and then all the parades and things that followed, and how I eventually ended up in the Occoquan workhouse. And I will end with my thoughts on what I hope the future holds for all of us. So some of the famous women at this time that really entranced us, and being good historians, one of the set of sisters that we knew about were Sarah and Angelina Grimke. Some of you may be familiar with the Grimke sisters. They were from the early 19th century. And Angelina ended up, the two of them, to be the one that was quite a spokesperson for their cause. They were daughters of, and part of a family that had 13 children. Sarah was the second oldest, and Angelina was the baby. And they saw some of the horrors of slavery on their own father's plantation. And they, as young women, especially after they would go to church on Sunday and hear about how we were all supposed to be taking care of one another, well, they confronted their father and said, "Father, this slavery thing really needs to go." Well, mind you, his father was a third generation slaveholder, so this wasn't anything that was likely to change overnight. They confronted the local churches and eventually were thrown out of Charleston, South Carolina. They landed in Philadelphia as Quakers, and so they adopted that religious orientation. And even within the Quaker sphere, they noticed that in the back of the Quaker meeting house was a bench, and that is where the Negro people were to sit. Well, Sarah and Angelina would not have anything of that, so they took to sitting in the back of the meeting house with them. One other interesting piece of Angelina and Sarah, Angelina had married a man named Theodore Weld, who was also an abolitionist. And when they were married, they had, and this caused quite a stir, and it was in the newspapers, they had a Negro clergy person and a white clergy person, and the guests were all mixed. And that was not a very common event in the early part of the 19th century. Mind you, that was before that great and awful Civil War. So those are a couple of ladies I want you to remember about. Another lady whose name you may be familiar with because of locations in our area is a woman named Dr. Kate Waller Barrett. Dr. Kate Waller Barrett. I understand there is now a school and a library named for her in Northern Virginia. And Dr. Kate Waller Barrett's story is absolutely fascinating. She also had 6 children. And as she and her husband, ironically, also Robert, who was a pastor, she was sitting in front of the fire on a cold, damp autumn night and enjoying this newborn little fellow that she had in her arms when there was a knock on the door. And she opened the door, and therein stood a lone woman with a baby in her arms as well. Dr. Kate was not about to turn her away. She brought her in. She had her sit down by the fire, and they chatted for the evening. Well, this young woman sadly did not have a husband. There had not been someone that stood by her to have this baby. And in their conversation, one of the things that Dr. Kate discovered was that was the only difference between the two of them, was that they had chosen different kinds of men. Well, the other thing that happened at that time, because there were also a belief at the end of the 19th century that if a man bedded a virgin, he would be cured. So across the United States, and this is not told in history books, unfortunately, there was a scourge of young, pregnant, very ill women. Dr. Kate Waller Barrett wanted to do something about that. She'd already met this young lady and understood her plight. So she had moved at that time from Virginia down to Atlanta and wondered if she could start a home for unwed mothers. Around the same time, up in New York City, a man named Dr. Charles Crittenton, he had lost his second child. And as he move through his grief. He would walk the streets at night with his pastor, and they would talk about certain things. And at night, one of the things that Charles Crittenden would see were young women walking the street to do some things they probably should not be doing. And it became very clear to him that the only way these young women were able to survive, because they had no skills, was to be able to do things that were not discussed publicly. So Mr. Crittenden went to the New York City Council, asked if a home for unwed mothers could be built, and the town council turned him down. He asked again a few years later, a second time, and yes, the city council, because this reality was becoming incredibly overwhelming, and city council said yes. The home was a grand success. Dr. Kate Waller Barrett down in Atlanta heard of Mr. Crittenden's success, wrote him a letter, said she wanted to do the same thing in Atlanta, but she did not have the funding to do so. Mr. Crittenden sent her a check for $5,000, and therein became really the birth of what eventually became known as the National Florence Crittenden Mission. Florence was the name of Dr. Crittenden's, or Mr. Crittenden's, daughter that he had lost. Mr. Crittenden was a very wealthy man. He dealt in pharmaceuticals. He was part of the beginning of this country's pharmaceutical industry. Over time, over 98 homes for unwed mothers dotted our country's landscape. One of the most famous was built outside of Clifton, Virginia. It was called Ivacota, and it lasted for many years because it was near Alexandria, where Dr. Kate Waller Barrett eventually landed with her 6 children. She was a frequent visitor out there, and it became known as kind of the jewel in the crown of all the National Florence Crittenden missions. Well, knowing the plight of young women at that time, Dr. Kate Waller Barrett made it her mind to make sure that as time went on, she could do everything she possibly could to pursue the rights of women. And in fact, in 1913, she decided with several other women to form the Equal Suffrage League in Virginia. And by 1920, with its original 13 members, that group had grown to over 30,000. So the word was getting out how important it was for women to be able to get the right to vote. And of course, another famous person of the mid 19th century was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Of over 300,000 copies were sold in America, and over 1 million in its first year of publication in England. And you may know the story of Abraham Lincoln having met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a small woman in stature, as I am, and saying to her, "So you're the little lady that caused that great big war." Well, as suffragists, we very much admired other women. They were mentors for us, models for us in terms of what we could do. And as time went on, it became very clear there was a lot of work to do here in the United States. By 1915, only 12 states, all west of the Mississippi, had the vote for women: Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Kansas, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Utah, and Illinois. Very few, if none, no states on the eastern part of the United States had the right to vote for women. One could say that because women helped settle the West is why they ended up with the right to vote. Wyoming was the very first state in which women had the right to vote. And ironically, also at that time, over 12 countries around the world had the right to vote for women: Denmark, Russia, Norway, New Zealand, Australia, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, Canada, Scotland, Wales. The list goes on with Ireland. So it was really not terribly democratic for us to be having a country where over 20 million women did not have the right to vote. Well, when Woodrow Wilson was elected, those of us that were suffragists, because by now we had banded together and we had started groups. I became president of the National Suffrage program in Baltimore. We decided we were going to show President Wilson on his day of coming into Washington, D.C., how important passing this 19th Amendment was. We did not want to see any more sick girls around this country. We did not want to see any more children that didn't have fathers. We wanted to make a difference in so many ways. And one other event I do want to make sure to remind you of, because we've just passed its anniversary this week, was the March 25th, 1911 horrific event called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in New York City. In that fire, over 145 girls ended up being burned. They were working as seamstresses on the 11th floor and on up for a couple of other floors in a tall building in New York City, locked into their spaces, not allowed to leave their chairs, not able to go to the bathroom when they needed to. It was a Saturday afternoon, and many of these girls were Jewish, and they needed to come home and be able to honor the Sabbath in some kind of way. Somehow a spark from a sewing machine ignited a barrel of fabric, all set aside because the two owners were afraid the girls might steal fabric. Anyway, that barrel caught on fire, and it was just a matter of minutes before the entire floor was engulfed in flames. Girls that tried to get out on the fire escape discovered that the fire escape was not strong enough to hold them, and they perished and fell to their death with the smoke and the heat and no way to really get to them. They began to jump out of windows because they had no choice. Yes, 145 girls died that day. So yes, we believed as women, we needed to do something about worker and especially women's safety in this country. So when Wilson came along, we believed this was a hope of a new beginning, that we might be able to come together and show him just how important it was for women to have the right to vote. So on the day we knew he was going to come into Washington, D.C., we ended up staging a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. Now we had gone, and mind you, this was Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, and they've become my very, very close friends. We wanted to be at the back, or at least in the parade, in the inaugural parade, on the day of Wilson's inauguration, but we were told because we were women, we could not. Well, Lucy then decided to push the parade back to a day before the inauguration. And so 8,000 of us showed up in Washington, D.C., carrying banners that said, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Well, those that watched the parade were folks from Congress and many other men that were in a place they probably should not have been. They might have been down getting ready to welcome Wilson, but they heard more about our parade and they wanted to make a bit of a menace of themselves. They jeered at us, yelled at us, threw rotten food at us, even attacked some of us girls to the ground. While one of the women who was marching with us was beat up and hurt so badly she had to be taken to the hospital. Her name was a name I imagine you would know. Her name was Helen Keller. She ended up becoming a very good friend of not just Thomas Edison, but also Mark Twain. So we had an amazing presence down Pennsylvania Avenue. But what happened then is when Woodrow Wilson got off his train at Union Station, no one was there to greet him. So ironically, we made a statement that said what we were doing was important. Well, to drive our point home on the 7th of April that year in 1913, we decided to stage another parade. This time we had over 10,000 women show up, and at the front of both of these parades was a lovely woman with long brunette hair carrying a sign and a banner that said, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Her name was Inez Mulholland, and she rode on a white horse, and she was our Joan of Arc, and she headed the parade again on the 7th of April, 1913, hoping that we would get enough support from the public that things would begin to change. Well, if you know your history, you'd probably know that not much did happen between 1913 and 1917, except at the beginning of the prior year, the United States began to take a stand on what was going on in Europe because World War I had broken out. We eventually joined in to protect democracy. And with that, my suffragist sisters were absolutely indignant that how could we be trying to protect democracy and giving our sons away when we as women did not even have the right to vote and have a democratic world that we could live in this country. Why, you might say this fight for the right to vote really began back in 1776, when Abigail Adams said to her husband, John, please remember the ladies as you write the doctrine of this great land when you go off to Philadelphia. Sadly, John did not, and so had the female pronoun been included in all of those papers, we would not be sitting here today. Sadly, that was not included, and so the fight began. In 1848, so many women were really disgusted with this lack of democracy in our land that they staged the first women's convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, all participated in that gathering of over 300 people. And one of the most distinguished speakers at that gathering was Frederick Douglass. And one of his pieces of advice to the women that gathered and men at this convention was to go out and agitate, agitate, agitate. Well, as suffragists, we have remembered that. And we remember that marching in a parade was as important as being able to actually have a conversation with the president. So by the time 1917 though rolled around and our sons were being taken for us and we were fighting for democracy across the ocean, we knew we had to do something different. So in January of that year, we began to picket in front of the White House. We would carry our banners that said out of the darkness and into the light. We would carry our banners that would say, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Well, it was not long before foreign dignitaries began to visit the United States. And by June, if a foreign dignitary was visiting and all these women were standing in front of the White House with their banners, it was somewhat embarrassing for the president. So yes, we finally did get his attention, but he tried to get our attention back by beginning to have us arrested on the charge of obstructing traffic. Now imagine that. Here we are in front of the White House with banners. We're not even standing in the street. And I've already shared with you that our choice of punishment could have been to pay a $25 fine or spend 60 days at the Occoquan workhouse, the DC jail for women. Of course, we chose the workhouse. I picketed that year, and as I mentioned, it was on the 14th of July in 1917 that I was arrested along with 16 other young women who had had enough, but we still wanted to be the ladies that Alice Paul and Lucy Burns wanted us to be. It was during that time that Alice Paul and all her outspoken intelligence really became quite disliked by Woodrow Wilson, and he wanted a psychiatrist to evaluate her to find out that perhaps she was crazy and then use that craziness as an excuse for her behavior and find a reason to put her down. Well, all the doctor said in response to President Wilson was that, all I can say, sir, is when I have examined a woman who is intelligent, who speaks her mind, she is often falsely deemed as being crazy. So that attempt at discrediting Alice Paul did not go very well. Well, by the time July rolled around, it was hot, it was muggy. You all know what it's like in July in Washington, D.C. And as I said, there were 16 of us that day that, yes, we got arrested too. We hadn't been standing in front of the White House but 5 minutes. So the arrests clearly had been planned. We were taken to the DC jail and eventually taken on out to the Occoquan workhouse. When we got to the Occoquan workhouse, we encountered a man named Superintendent Whitaker. Superintendent Whitaker had been a superintendent over at the Lorton prison when it first opened in the early 1910s, 1911s. And he believed in rehabilitation of prisoners, that sunshine, good food, learning a new skill, abstaining from alcohol could help somebody onto a life and be given a second chance. As suffragists, we could not quite figure out what happened. What happened between that time when he ran the Lorton prison to the time of Occoquan? He became a changed man. And as I was on the bus heading on out to the Occoquan workhouse, realizing that things were going to change quite drastically for me when I arrived there, I remembered an event that happened when I went to visit Robert down on the dock one day. He became an importer of foreign goods, and his office was down in Baltimore on the inner harbor there. And I was in his office one day, and in came this darling little 27-year-old woman with red curly hair and 3 cherubic children that were just absolutely darling. And she was pregnant with her 7th child. I knew this family did not have much money. So I went home that night and I told our cook named Mary, we need to put together a dinner for them after that baby comes. And I will take it down personally and I will present it to that family and see the rest of her precious children. So Mary put that basket together for me, and on a similarly cold and damp and chilly night, just as when that young lady came to visit Dr. Kate Waller Barrett, I headed on down to the Inner Harbor in Baltimore. And I found the area where George and his wife, Rebecca was the young lady with the red hair, and her husband was George. I found where they lived. Well, I heard things at night and I smelled things at night that I had never, ever heard before and seen before in my time in living in a very different part of Baltimore. Many men were inebriated. Many men were screaming and shouting. I got to George and Rebecca's door and I went to knock, and all of a sudden I heard a giant thunk against a wall. And things became silent, and I realized that was George, who had just thrown his wife against a wall and calling her at the same time a no-good harlot, the mother of his children. This is how he was treating her. I was scared. I didn't do what I came there to do, and I left. I went home. I was embarrassed. I told Mary what had happened, and she reminded me, you know, Mrs. Walker, you're a part of this organization that you talk about, you know, Alice Paul. You need to stay. You need to stay. You need to keep fighting for women. That was my first epiphany moment in making sure I indeed stayed the course in being a suffragist. And by the time I got to the Occoquan workhouse, myself and my other sisters, and upon meeting Mr. Whitaker, it was very clear to me this was going to be possibly another epiphany. He yelled at us when we arrived, "My mama ain't no suffragist. No reason y'all should be any kind of suffragist." And with that, we had our glasses, our jewelry, our clothing, our everything taken away from us and put into prison garb that apparently had been washed. Unlike the blankets we found for the cots that we had to sleep on in our cells, blankets that smelled of urine and vomit. Oh, they kind of knew we were coming. And because Whitaker was a little concerned about these uppity ladies, as we were called, he was afraid of a mutiny. So all of the Negro girls at the prison were charged with finding us, if they ever did, alone, and beating us up. He wanted to do everything he could to keep a mutiny from happening. Well, yes, while I was there, we were not allowed to talk. We only received a letter once a month. Our mail was censored. But in the silent dining hall one day, my eyes met a young Negro lady, and we did a half a smile at each other. I knew in a different time and place, we might have even become friends. Sadly, within a week, I walked around a corner of the prison, and there was Sally, and she knew what she was supposed to do. And yes, she smashed me in the face. And yes, I ended up with a black eye. And I knew in that very moment that when people were asked to behave like such animals, I had to get back out there and picket and make sure women got the right to vote. That was my second epiphany moment. But the next day or two, all of my suffragist sisters had another epiphany moment, for one of the Negro girls gave birth to another baby boy. And we all came together and agreed this child shall not be raised in a world where women don't have equal rights. All that did was spur us on to make a difference and to get that 19th Amendment passed. Well, after 1917 and towards the very end of 1917 was an awful event that became known as the Night of Terror, November 14th through 15th, when over 40 of my suffragist sisters were taken to Occoquan. They were treated brutally, thrown downstairs. Our 75-year-old sister, Mary Nolan, thrown into their cells. One of my sisters passed out that her cellmate thought she was dead until the next morning. It was an awful, awful time. Well, those kinds of atrocities, including the fact that Lucy Burns had just been jailed there and been into a forced feeding mode with a tube down her throat, and to which she was fed an egg yolk and flour because she had dared to start a hunger strike. Oh, President Wilson did not want a martyr on his watch, so he made sure that any of the girls on hunger strikes somehow got some kind of nourishment, but it was a bloody, awful, painful mess. Oh, we knew all of this was going on, and eventually this story, the story of the awfulness at the Occoquan workhouse, created a turning point in our history as suffragists. The story hit the newspapers all over the country, and pretty soon it made Wilson look pretty embarrassed. The next year, he went to Congress and finally said, you can vote on this 19th Amendment. He did not get the votes that he needed. So he turned it all over to the states. And in that following summer, now we're up to 1920, a young new congressman in Tennessee, a man named Harry Byrne, he was thought to be able to be a more conservative thinker in terms of that 19th Amendment. And what we as suffragists had done is, as these votes were taken across the country, and we needed 36 states to be able to ratify this 19th Amendment. If somebody did not agree with the 19th Amendment, we gave them a red rose to wear on their lapel. For those that did, we gave them a yellow rose to wear on their lapel. We weren't sure which way Harry was going to go, but what we didn't know is that night before, his mama had written him a letter, and she said, "Now, Harry, you make sure you do the right thing. You make sure tomorrow you put that rat in ratification." And thankfully, Harry listened to his mother, and Tennessee became the 36th state on which, and representing of, a purple star was sewn on a banner from a great big banner in Washington, D.C., where Alice Paul was located at that time, and the 19th Amendment was on its way to being passed. It was officially passed on the 26th of August in 1920. Well, I won't tell you how I voted in that 1920 election, if it was for Warren Harding or James Cox, because that is not what the suffragists wanted to do. We wanted to simply educate women and help them understand that they had a say in their future, in their day-to-day life. Well, we all know what did happen. Warren Harding, in fact, was elected. And I was so proud to be able to vote in 1920 in that November presidential election. Well, I knew our work wasn't quite done, although some wonderful things happened as a result of the work the suffragists did. The League of Women Voters was founded, which is still, as I understand, very alive today. Also, the General Federation of Women's Clubs took a turn at being able to support the suffragist movement, and does still to this day. Well, I'll tell you about a most recent occurrence, and then I shall end my words and hear some questions from you. So one night, oh my goodness, just a few weeks ago, I woke up with the most awful, awful nightmare, the most awful nightmare. And what happened in that nightmare was a young woman who I could not tell her, she had dark skin, but she was on a bus, perhaps with some other teenage girls that were going to school. This kind of a bus kind of vehicle was taking them away. And on it, some mean men got on the bus and were shooting the girls because they wanted an education. And this one young woman got shot right in her face. But she lived. I do remember that in the dream, but she had a funny name. It was Mala, something like Malala. Anyway, when I woke from that dream, it became very, very clear to me that women all over the world still needed to have the right to vote, and that women's rights still weren't probably where they needed to be. For you see, in that first election, only 30% of American women voted. I can imagine a lot of women in this country lived with a George, as Rebecca did, who did not want to have their wives go out and vote. But as I leave you today, I want you to remember our story. It is a story of goodness and having been redeemed and having made a difference in our country. I want you to remember the characters I've spoken of. I want you to remember the stories of being taken down to the Occoquan workhouse and what a horrific experience that was for us uppity ladies. But I also want you to walk away today from being very clear that never again in this great land of ours should our mothers, our sisters, our grandmothers, our daughters, our cousins, or our children ever have to say, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes. And
That was
again,
wonderful.
yes.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, oh, look at, I have these little hands in the pictures I see. That's very encouraging. I understand you might have some questions. So
We start with a comment from Pat that Mississippi was the last continental U.S. state to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1984.
Yes, that is correct. I shall tell you when it was for Virginia. Virginia was 1952. Yes.
Another question, is it known if the children born in these homes for unwed mothers were placed for adoption or what happened to them?
No, the Florence Crittenton mission was a very pronouncedly focused mission on women keeping their babies. Dr. Kate Weller Barrett felt it was unkind for a baby to be taken from its mother. And so the time spent that a Florence Crittenton mission home would have been up to 3 years for the child to begin on her footing, and for, similar to the Lorton Workhouse, for a woman to learn a new skill. Many of the women went on to become nurses because they practiced on their sisters. And so nursing became one of the kind of flagship careers that the Florence Crittenton mission provided. At one time, over 98 missions were in this area across the country, and they did wonderful work. They really, really did. And as time went on, even delinquent girls were sent to a National Florence Crittenton mission to give these girls a second chance. And much like with Lorton, fresh air, sunshine, good food, daily devotions, also being able to learn a new skill, chair caning, rug making, fruit canning, all kinds of things many of these girls had not had exposure to were part of their time. So they could leave and take their baby with them. It was not until probably the 1950s that became, 40s, 50s became a little more common. Yeah.
In your talk, you stressed the role of young women. Was the movement mainly composed of young women?
Actually not. Many of the women that participated were more middle-aged. At this time I'm seeing you today, my age would have been around, mid 40s. But no, many of the kind of socialite women in this country took to marching as suffragists because they had the time and they had the financial wherewithal. So many young women were probably either still raising their children or working, if they were working at all, as teachers. Their careers were very, very limited in terms of what they could do.
Is your home in Baltimore still standing, and is it someplace we could visit?
The home in Baltimore, I shall tell you a bit about. It was called Drumkizel, an odd spelling, DRUMQUHEZEL, I believe. And it was named after a Scottish fortress. My husband's heritage was from Scotland. And one of the things that I did there when he and I moved in, I hung banners from the second floor window that said, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And I don't need to tell you that the neighborhood was not quite thrilled with that kind of energy. And although Robert and I had been in the Blue Book in Baltimore for some years, by the time 1919 rolled around and those banners had been hanging on our second story windows for quite some time, we were not included in the Blue Book. No, the home is not there, but the name is still sustained in a little area of Baltimore, and there is now a little tiny strip shopping mall, little tiny, called Drumkizel. That's all that's lasted.
And here, what an interesting history lesson. Thank goodness for those uppity ladies.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Let's see. A question here about how did you get into this spellbinding role?
Well, thank you. And this is actually it's a very sweet story, and it's going to have kind of little two pieces to it. For many years, I have done leadership seminars and done a lot of public speaking. I've done a lot of work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so speaking was not alien to me. Back in 2008, I was part of a League of Women Voters group, and we were going to make this little tiny memorial to honor the suffragists that had been incarcerated at Occoquan, and to kind of launch this little plan, which ended up turning into a very large and very expansive and beautiful plan eventually. I was tasked with going to a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Griffith, who had been the headmistress at the Madeira School. She had done her doctoral dissertation on Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and so she was the perfect person to be able to come and kind of launch this little gathering for us. And she was very accommodating. My daughter, as in my real person, as in Lynne Garvey, was a Madeira girl, so I did know Dr. Griffith very well. And so she was going to be our little keynote speaker. 2 weeks before the event, she canceled. I had to go to my League of Women Voters group and explain what had happened. And they just got stunned for a minute and then looked at me and said, Lynne, you like to talk. Why don't you just pretend you're a suffragist? So I had 2 weeks to do research and find a suffragist that I thought could match my age and my who matched my age and kind of my energy. And I found one that had been arrested in the middle of July, on July 14th. And so I did research on Mrs. Robert Walker. And I spent 2 weeks putting my monologue together, which was not a whole lot different than what you heard today. It's parts of it were a little bit different because it was longer. But anyway, so I performed that then, dressed similarly to how you see me dressed today in July of 2008. And I thought that would be a one-off event and my life would go on. Well, I made the front picture of the local Connection magazine newspaper, and the rest is history. I have performed for many, many groups. I absolutely adore Mrs. Robert Walker. I have found, in fact, the grandchildren of Mrs. Robert Walker have found me. I was told by the Baltimore Library there were no descendants. That was not true. And the one granddaughter that I hooked up with who came out to visit me, in fact, to see me perform, is a woman named Susan. She now lives in Hawaii. And as I had her over to my house to fix dinner, we were working in the kitchen together. And of course, we talked about where we went to college. So Susan Walker had gone to University of Colorado in Boulder. So had I. Susan Walker lived in a house called Shannon's on the Hill, an all-girl rooming house. So had I. And we had been there at different times in different places, but the connection with the Walker family has been a real treat along the way. So I just kind of fell into this. I loved it. I do other characters right now. I also reenact Angelina Grimke, who I spoke of. But one other little piece, and I'll share this with you because I know we're about ready to close. The National Florence Crittenton Mission. I've spoken of that. Some of you have heard of that before. Yes? No? Some of you have? Yeah. Lynne Garvey Hodge was born in a Florence Crittenton home in Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh.
So this performance means a lot to me. It comes from my heart. And I do want to mention the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial. If you can get down there to the Occoquan Workhouse, for some of you, it would make a wonderful, wonderful field trip when the weather is nice. The gardens are beautiful. It's an outdoor monument with 19 different stations describing the history. I am also a docent out there. I just docented out there last weekend. So you can contact them through the Nova Parks group. The Turning Point Suffragist Memorial is very, very pretty. There's a rotunda with Carrie Chapman Cadenet, who was another leader in the suffrage movement. There's a statue for Mary Church Terrell, who was a African-American suffragist, and then welcoming you into the entire suffragist memorial is a statue of Alice Paul. It's very, very pretty. And I was one of the founding members of that also. So that's made all this happen. Is that it? Are we done, Gary? That's
yeah, I think I'm going to stop the recording and